Howdy there, brethren. Yes, I just thought I'd make a video about something different, about creation. I'm going on a geology excursion. It's about 3 months away, but I'm quite looking forward to it. Creation science was something that made me see the light, I guess. And when I was convinced by creation science, it was one of the things. Also, the state of the world led me into creation science. I briefly spoke about it in my testimony that I put on YouTube back in May last year. That testimony was around the time I'd been saved for about a year. But yeah, time flies. Time flies, money flies, and blow flies. That's just something that's a saying my dad used to say, and I told my dad I'd keep that one going. It doesn't really mean anything, I suppose. But yeah, creation science. And in my testimony that I put on YouTube back in May last year, I was into the arguments of peak oil and how we were going to overcome this. And as a concerned father, I was worried about peak oil. No one really that of my close friends was worried about it. I made some friends through that same concern locally. I was a member of a community garden, and I met a lady through that who was concerned about peak oil. But the online community was very intelligent and stuff. Talking about oil depletion rates and how it's a fossil fuel and all this sort of stuff. But anyway, I used to hear stories of these creationists that say, or just people that say, oh, those oil wells, they just replenish over the years, and they've gone back and had a look, and they've seen that the oil's come back up. And I just thought these people are crazy. There's people out there who think the oil comes back. Anyway, I heard about these things, and this is not the exact video. This one's about 7 years old, but I did see some information on the web that oil, in fact, is not a fossil fuel. But anyway, I thought I'd just play this because it's interesting, and when I go on my geology excursion, I'm going to ask the creation geologist a little bit about what this fellow here is talking about. I just had my light off. I'll have to turn my light on for a second. His name is Dr. Emil Silvestro. Anyway, I'll put the link in the description. Yeah, and we'll just play and I'll keep it rolling.
Well, flood is, you've got metamorphic rock.
Oops.
Rock, you've got sedimentary, metamorphic, and igneous, and you've got metamorphic rock, and on top of that, there's many very thick layers of sedimentary rock. There's not enough time in the flood to metamorphose those rocks and then lay down the thick layers.
Well, that's a very correct assumption, but it's only that, an assumption. Basically,
Sure.
The idea that first you have to lay down some sediments or whatever that was, create a metamorphic rock, and then to lay down the sediments on top of them. What about laying down a huge pile of sediments from the very beginning, and then having these hydrothermal solutions that I mentioned before, penetrating through them, and the lower layers turn into what today look like metamorphic rocks. And the rest is sediments. So there's no time gap between the two. All you had initially was a huge pile of sediment, and a part of it has been metamorphosed.
Right.
Actually, geologists also have another concept, retromorphose. So you might have a certain grade of metamorphic rock, say a medium grade, and on top of it, underneath it actually, you have a lower grade of metamorphic rock. Well, that's against the rule, because according to the rule, the deeper you go, the higher the grade of metamorphic rock, or type of, because the forces are more intense.
Yeah.
Well, that is an area where some solutions have penetrated and reduced the grade of the metamorphic rock, right? So So there's the key to the entire issue. You have solutions penetrating through a huge pile of homogeneous sediments, and it can change into a sedimentary rock, into metamorphic rock, because of the solutions.
See, it's all the assumptions, and that drives this issue so powerfully. It's like, what are your assumptions about what happened back in history?
Right.
You know, if your assumptions are millions.
Yeah, and unfortunately, these creationists, CMI, and a lot of creations in general are young Earth creationists. They don't believe in the Genesis gap, which I do. I think there's plenty of biblical evidence for it, but we don't have to talk about that now. But because they write off the Genesis gap, it sort of happened back when there was a big push on creation science to distance themselves from the evolution, because there's more than one gap theory, and they wanted to distance themselves from evolution that much that there could be billions of years gap, that they sort of just dismissed it and threw the baby out with the bathwater. It's a bit like how we've got the gospel, the mainstream if it's mainstream, the mainstream evangelicals saying repent of your sins before you even believe on the Lord Jesus. It's it's not, that's probably not the best thing, analogy, example, but because they compromise on the truth, they've got all sorts of problems, because these young Earth creationists have things in the landscape they can't explain. But if they looked at there was actually two floods, there was Noah's flood and one before it, they might be able to explain things a bit better and not look like total fools to geologists who aren't Christian. And there's a lot of geologists who have become Christian through their career, which is quite interesting, and that's something I learnt when I came across creation science, when I was coming around to believing that God must be real and the gospel must be true, that Jesus died for my sins, and that's the only way to get eternal life. Because I was raised with that gospel as a kid, I knew the gospel, and I sort of, once I believed in God, I fell back on the gospel. So it's a bit different to someone who hasn't heard it. But yes, anyway, I'll keep playing. So yeah, they are compromised. Young Earth creationists are compromising the truth by just outright denying all gap facts, every single one of them, when the biblical gap fact is actually very credible. Anyway, I'll keep playing.
Of years, you've got to fit everything into millions of years. Then you've got these explanations and these apparent contradictions for a global flood, but they can be explained so easily. Lay it all down at once, metamorphose the rocks, only certain layers at the bottom.
Yeah. Not only that, you're dealing with an event, this global flood. I mean, we can't study that event to see what could have happened. It was a very significant, unique event, and we're trying to look at things today and try to translate that into an event that we weren't there to see, and it was very unique.
In addition to that, you run some lab experiments, right? So basically, you interpret a fact by what you can create in the lab, but you can create the similar thing in a lab using a different approach. So you should present all the variants and then choose which fits the bigger model. But no, they're all eliminated except for one.
But nevertheless, I guess the point of all this is that we can explain the observations within a biblical context of a young creation and a global flood.
Right. Now, another objection people have said is, creationists have said, okay, the oil...
This is the interesting bit where they talk about oil.
The fossil fuels, the biomass that got buried at the time of the flood created things like oil and coal and all that. And one objection has been posed that there's too much oil. There's far too much there to have been created with what would have been there at the time of the flood.
In a sudden event, catastrophic, yes. But here's the point. There's another assumption, that oil comes from dead creatures. Well, what is oil? Hydrocarbon, right? Combination of hydrogen and carbon. Look to the outer planets. They're called gaseous planets, from Jupiter on. Saturn, Neptune, Uranus. They all have, and their moons too, methane gas.
Not that I believe in outer planets. I'm a bit like Max Bauer, and I hope Max is going okay. God bless Max. We've been thinking about you and praying for you, mate. But anyway, yeah, I don't believe that. I don't think there's. I think the Earth is geocentric myself, but I don't think it's flat, and I would never say it was flat, because that flat Earth versus the globe is just another Hegelian dialectic from the devil, if you ask me. The devil's very clever. He can make these two contradicting sides and try to get you to pick one. And yeah, I've spoken about that before. I'm not going to go into that, but yeah. So yeah, I don't really believe. I can't prove for myself things in outer space. So I'm not going to believe anyone. There's enough lies about science that you can prove that are wrong. So why would I believe science that you can't prove either way? So that's my point of view. Anyway, keep playing, sorry.
Methane fluid and methane solid. Well, those are hydrocarbons, and they do not come from dead creatures. Right. So they all agree that that's from the original creation of those planets. Question is, why would only those planets have hydrocarbons? Why wouldn't the Earth also have it, but deep down, like in the Earth's mantle? Right. And that's where it comes towards the surface, and is captured in those sedimentary traps. So that's the so-called abiogenetic origin of oil. That oil is not actually coming from dead creatures, although it could come a part of it. But most of it comes from the original hydrocarbons that were incorporated in the planet as the planet was created.
So then the term fossil fuels may not be accurate.
No, it's just like the living fossils. It's either living or
That's
fossil.
interesting, isn't it?
It's one of those things. But the truth of the matter is there's solid scientific arguments. There are reservoirs that have been pumped out and they were considered finished and then recharged. They refilled with oil. They keep pumping to this day. If that's a sedimentary origin from the time of the sediments formed, there's no way it should refill. So it has to have another source deeper down. You take out the oil and new oil is coming up, refilling it.
Okay. So oil is being produced today, possibly, not the result of buried biomass in the flood, but it's still being produced today. What does that do to the whole ecology movement and that religion of
Don't want to go there. We all know what that means. It's almost like
and the price of fuel, right?
We don't want to get into some really, upsetting topics here. We stick to creation evolution.
Well, I mean, it's not. I'm just saying, it's not a lot of people know about that, right?
Yes.
That and yet this is secular scientists that talk about this. The potential that oil is still being formed in the mantle today. Very interesting stuff.
Yeah, that is interesting. The next bit is 2040. Sorry, 2040 roughly. Okay, I might turn the sound down a bit. It's a bit loud. Yeah. So, creating scarcity, because you can imagine Rockefeller, if he couldn't say that his oil was fossil fuel and that it was scarce, he would get a lot less money for it. So they had to say, I've heard the same case with diamonds. Apparently there's plenty of diamonds, but they say they're more rare than they are to put the price up. But oil, we always pay the amount that we can bear. And when I was into peak oil, the price would go up to a point, and as soon as consumption dropped, that would force the price down, and then the price would sneak back up, and people be paying what they can actually bear. And it's always, fuel at the pump is always something that varies so much compared to everything else. And it's just, we've been exploited by oil, but where they just said the whole ecology movement, what does it say about that? The people, like the Rockefellers, the ones behind big oil, are the ones who started all these environmental groups. And that's what got me thinking about, hey, what's going on here? And it's not, we got the people who exploited all the oil are the ones who were concerned about the environment. Didn't make much sense. It was because it was a contradiction. But yeah, oil mightn't be as rare as they're making out, which is interesting.
Accurate.
No, it's just like the living fossils. It's either living or fossil,
They're going to talk about coal here, which is interesting too.
It's one of those things. But the truth of the matter is there's solid scientific arguments. There are reservoirs that have been pumped out and they were considered finished, and then recharged.
Sorry.
They refilled with oil. They
Right.
keep pumping to this day. If that's a sedimentary origin from the time of the sediments form, there's no way it should refill. So it has to have another source deeper down. You take out the oil, and new oil is coming up, refilling
Okay,
it.
okay. So oil's being produced.
This is an
And you can find. And then further on, you find some of. A tree produces way more volume.
an obvious
Okay,
conclusion
sorry.
when watching ships disappear over the horizon and by observing eclipse
I found the
shadows.
wrong mark.
What does the Bible say? The implication of a round earth is seen in the New Testament, where Jesus described his
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Okay.
It's cool for that to have happened. How do you explain that? Because that's a different type of substance
We're talking
than
about
the
coal
oil
now.
would be.
But it also, a tree produces way more volume in terms of what can be turned into coal than any given dead animal, right?
All right.
So there are trees that weigh 200 tons today.
Right.
You know, so these huge trees produce a lot of coal because that's going to turn into a bigger volume of coal. But the important thing is to keep in mind that we're all estimating these things based on the density of the forests and the biomass that we see today.
Right.
While that's not exactly the same thing that existed before the flood. If you just simply consider Sahara, for example, and all the deserts, and the high plateaus like Tibet and Gobi, and all the territories that have no forests today, covered with heavy forests.
Right.
There's a tremendous amount of wood in there. Right? And then the wood, during the flood, as the trees are uprooted and they scratch each other, they're going to lose their bark, so the bark is going to sink first to the bottom. And that's one kind of a coal that you can form and you can find. And then further on you find some of the heavier trees and then the lighter trees. So various layers of deposition of wood debris. But what is important also to keep in mind is that with this ascent of hydrocarbons that I mentioned before, they are going also to push a lot of carbon, elementary carbon, from inside the rocks towards the surface. And as this carbon moves upwards, it's going, because what you have, you start down there with a lot of hydrocarbons, and as they move up, they start losing hydrogen until eventually you're only left with carbon, elementary carbon, emerging towards the surface.
Right.
I can imagine when this carbon meets, so it goes through a layer of wooden debris, it's going to turn it into coal, just like that, in an instant, as it filters through it. And then further
Yeah,
up, another layer of
interesting, hey?
buried trees and that was also turned into coal. But the volume of if you consider the pre-flood world as a supercontinent,
Right.
and the climate globally mild and even, you could have a tremendous amount of biomass, which would basically account for most of this coal.
So again, we're dealing with starting assumptions and unique events, and it's just
And what you compare
Starting assumptions too, that there was only one flood that can make some of these things in the landscape come unstuck for the young Earth creationists.
with.
right.
They only have the density of today.
That's right. So again,
But still, mankind is only 6,000 years old. I believe that.
for Christians to look at somebody's argument just on face value and just go, oh well, we're going to drop our swords here and say, yeah, it must be right. This couldn't have happened. It bears further investigation, and creationists have some great
Yeah,
arguments.
I mean, years ago, these were real problems. But I mean, the modern creation revival, if you want to call it that, started in the mid '70s. This is 2009, 2010, and there's been a lot of research done.
Yes.
To explain some of these.
Yeah, and they denied the gap. And according to people like Michael Pearl, Bible believers from centuries ago always believed there was the gap that explained the fall of Lucifer. And the creationists who came along, this CMI was actually, Creation Magazine was started by a doctor here where I live, a medical doctor who just made a magazine and put it in his surgery for his patients to read. But yeah, the modern creationist movement really fought hard against the gap fact.
Issues, these questions. And so, like, another question is the petrified forest, like you see in Yellowstone, for example. There's multiple layers of petrified trees, and the interpretation is this couldn't be formed, this is millions of years here. How does that work in a flood?
Well, to start with, one significant thing they always fail to mention is that those fossilized trees or petrified trees have no roots.
Yeah.
They're just pieces of trunks of.
This was another thing that I found interesting when I came across creation science, was the vertical tree trunks, which are obviously vertical tree trunks that went through different layers, horizontal layers of sediment that was supposed to be laid down over millions of years. In a coal seam, you'd have, you know, mainstream geologists going, this layer here is so many millions, and then the layer above that is like the ones at the bottom is like 400 million, and then it gradually, as you work your way to the top in the layers, you get less and less, millions of years. But you've got like a tree trunk going through all these different levels, and you think, well, how does that happen? It has to be deposited there from a flood.
But not the whole tree.
So they didn't grow there.
They didn't grow there. They've been transported. Now, if you look, and I used to dive, I remember years back, in a lake up in the mountains, and like 10 meters down, in almost the darkness line, I could see these shadows through the water. Huge tree trunks, which get, you know, loaded with water, and they start sinking. Yeah,
yes.
and because they're heavy at the base, they tend to stand vertical. And as they would sink to the bottom, they would rest like that on the sediment.
Right.
Bury them quickly, do another one like that, and bury them quickly, another one. What you have is very different levels of wood buried suddenly during a catastrophe like the flood. And then you have the solutions coming that I mentioned before, the hydrothermal solutions, which carry minerals, and they're going to replace the wood with mineral matter, and they were going to bind together the grains of sand into a sandstone. And what you get? Multiple layers of fossilized forests, but actually not forests.
Running theme here is that these hydrocarbons and hydrothermal processes. Well, that's your background, isn't it? Karst landscapes and things happening in caves and how the limestone gets eaten away by acidic or whatever you want to do, that type of solution in the landscape.
And this answer that you just gave us about the different forests is explained perfectly in a DVD you can get from our website called Mount St. Helens, where the exact same thing happened in Spirit Lake.
Yes.
It's a very interesting DVD.
Anyway, I hope you found that interesting. Yeah, it's something to think about anyway, and I'm, you know, thinking about questions. I know it's like 3 months away, but I'm thinking about questions to ask this doctor of geology when I go on the excursion with my kids. But you know, I'm not going to have a fight with him about the gap theory or anything like that. You know, I don't want to cause any arguments. I'm looking for a landscape that I can show my children to prove Noah's flood. Anyway, I hope you got something out of this. I find it very fascinating. Since I was worried about peak oil, there might be just heaps of it coming out of the earth. and coal, he explained how coal was formed as well, which is interesting. Anyway, cheers and God bless.